today's complex workplace, how should leaders respond? We were having a discussion about the subject before we started, while you guys were all listening to Julian. And one of the things I was saying is I've just come back from a conference in Prague where we were talking about uncertainty and specifically how you plan for 2025 and beyond when thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow is pretty frightening. And we turn on the news and we're like, oh my God, what is going on there? We were talking about Brexit and Trump and the whole geopolitical situation, which means kind of planning ahead has become a lot more difficult than it was kind of 6 months, a year ago. And that really puts a lot of pressure on leaders. So one of the things that we're going to be discussing today is what is HR's responsibility in developing the kind of leaders who can cope with that uncertainty and don't just freeze, but are able to take people with them kind of on a journey. So I'm just going to introduce my panel very quickly and then I'll let them say a few words about themselves. So on this side, got Kevin Ball, who's VP HR at, got the letters CDK Global, I'm sorry. Got Kate Hesk, who's Managing Partner at TPC Leadership, which just has rebranded from the Performance Coach. We have Gemma Bullivant, who is currently HR Director at Bluefin Solutions, although she's about to go and join the gig economy, something else. And Paula Leach, who is CPO at the Home Office. So we'll sit down. I'm just going to ask, going from Kevin, just give us a quick couple of seconds on why you're interested in the subject, why you wanted to take part in the panel.
I'm interested in the subject because I manage HR for an organisation of 9,000 people in 32 countries, and if I'm not interested in leadership, I'm probably not doing my job.
And so as Managing Partner of TPC Leadership, our interest is about how to help leaders lead in the moment, really. To Katie's point, the pace of life means that being a leader in the moment and engaging and inspiring other people is absolutely critical to the job of being a leader. But that's not just at the top of organisations, that's throughout. So we help support individuals, teams and organisations to think about what that means for them and to be resilient at the same time.
I, as Katie mentioned, I'm HR Director, but also I work increasingly independently as well. And leadership is front and centre of most of what I help organisations with. To build on some of the other interests which I also have, I am also doing a master's. I'm really interested in employee engagement and obviously the part that leadership plays in that. So I'm researching employee engagement and the connection of that with business productivity and also linking with coaching. So, really interested in the topic at both the business level and also increasingly kind of looking at it from an academic perspective as well, which is quite scary. That's sort of some of my key interests.
So you will have all heard of the Home Office, and you're probably very familiar with the work that we do. I think we make it into the news headlines practically every day, at least once or twice. So in terms of the agenda for this session, leading in a complex, fast-paced, changing world, everybody who works and leads in our organisation has a huge amount of pressure to deliver under great scrutiny and for the citizens, for all of us in the country. So leadership is absolutely vital in that environment, and we have some brilliant examples of it, and we also have the opportunity to be absolutely the best that we can be. And when you talk about leadership at all levels, and obviously we're a very hierarchical, very traditional type of organisation, and yet we've got people leading, for example, the border operation at Heathrow. Those people are not particularly senior leaders. They're managing people in shift environments with very, very tough, circumstances. And we need those people to be the best they can be in terms of leading that human system, as well as everybody at the top of a very strategic system. So it's absolutely my interest as HR Director. It's one of the cornerstones of our people strategy. So that's why I'm here.
Fantastic. So we've got quite a small room, so I don't think anybody has to feel nervous about asking a question, because there's only about 30 people in here to laugh at you if it's a stupid question. I promise you won't laugh at you. I'm sure there'll be fantastic questions. So I'm going to lead the discussion, but if you want to chip in, question or comment, please just stick your hand up. I don't really want to stand on ceremony, so I'll start, but if you have a violent disagreement with anything that I say or the panel say, or just want to ask something that you're specifically interested in, please just join in. So the first thing I want to touch on is talking about the context in which today's leaders find themselves in. I'm sure we've all heard that expression VUCA because we all work in HR and we get a lot of HR conferences, so we know it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Kate, how do you find that your clients are reacting to that? What kind of things are they asking you for now that perhaps they weren't in the past?
So the volatility and the ambiguity means that people have to think very quickly in the moment. And so that whole sense of resilience that I mentioned before, how to do more with less time specifically. So partly about how to manage time and manage priorities, but more importantly, how to hold oneself, be aware, so that the leader themselves can react positively in the moment, but also that they can engage with others and inspire others to come with them. So that whole motivation piece, whilst, often not really knowing how they should be reacting themselves. So it's that mutuality, if you like, that duality of leading myself whilst I'm connecting with others. That's the challenge.
And Kevin, in your kind of organisation, it's global. How has the conditions in which people have to operate changed?
Oh, enormously. So we build software for the automotive industry. So we have industry change, we have enormous changes of people's expectations in terms of what software can do for them. As soon as God made the iPhone, everybody expected business-to-business software to be just as intuitive, just as sensible, just as easy. And I guess we all work with HRIS, so we know that it's not. So our environment changes, the technology changes, our ability to recruit and retain people is under constant pressure everywhere in the world. So things change really fast. And I think that our answer to that in leadership terms is about working with leaders in the sense of what they are to be rather than what it is they have to do. I think there was kind of heated agreement amongst us in our pre-conversation that anything that you think that you used to be able to teach leaders to do probably isn't going to work any longer. Probably you need to look instead at what leaders need to find in themselves, whether that's resilience, whether that's ingenuity, whether that's fostering engagement, whether that's the things that they can find in themselves in order to be able to work with the people that they work with. That's closer to an answer to all of that volatility than anything that you can expect to be able to deliver in a classroom that's going to meet ambiguous situations that they're going to face when they come to try and do their jobs.
And when we had our pre-discussion, one of the words that came out of it a lot was self-awareness. So how, and either of you want to jump in, how do you develop that kind of self-awareness in leaders?
I think permission that actually is the sort of the front and centre what's important in leadership, and kind of reinforcing that, and leading kind of by example that self-awareness is key, and that vulnerability is okay. In fact, it's actually something that can really foster strong trust, and people can respect that leaders don't always have all of the answers, and in fact leaders want your input and want to kind of involve others in kind of getting a broader input into ideas and so on. So I think self-awareness is pivotal. I think the other aspect of self-awareness is really understanding. I call it the anchor. So when the environment is changing, when it's really difficult to kind of know what's going to happen from one moment to the next, do leaders really understand their own anchor? Because if they don't understand their own anchor, what's kind of really holding them strong, they're not going to be in a position to help others, and help others find their anchors too. So for me, that self-awareness is really key on a number of levels.
And Paula, we were discussing kind of what leadership even means in your organisation, and it's almost that people have a different definition. What leadership is to one person is perhaps different to another, and you were giving us some insight in how you're dealing with that.
Yeah, so I've been at the Home Office for 2 years. I'm not a civil servant. My background's in the private sector, and I've been Chief People Officer since April this year. And all the time that I've been there, I go around, I talk to people in the organisation, I talk to our leaders, and I ask them what's important, and they always say we need better leadership. So that's really interesting. So then I ask, obviously, as you would, so what does that mean? And then, we start to get into a sort of a different conversation. And a number of things I've noticed. One is, a lot of this, it appears to be everybody else as opposed to me, the leader. So that's an interesting observation. The other thing is it does mean different things, because I've got, very big operational parts of the business with large volumes of people, working in very difficult sort of circumstances. And then I've got sort of very small pockets of high strategy type people. So, what it means to lead those groups of people is really, really different. So we've been doing some work around trying to help the organisation define the outcome of leadership rather than just we want better leadership, because I feel that it would be easy for me to walk away from that and just put in place some leadership programmes and say, here we go, and we've got a process metric, haven't we? How many people have been on, this leadership programme? How much money have we spent? How many people still have to go on it? And we were having a bit of this discussion beforehand, because there is absolutely a place for really good leadership programmes. But what we're trying to do, and we're starting purposefully at the top of the organisation, is look at much more of a continuous process for learning, to embed this kind of role modelling of curiosity amongst our top leaders. Now, I could say we would need to do that throughout the organisation, but I'm quite of the firm belief that if I do it lower down in the organisation and I don't do it at the top, it's going to be quite hard to get that to embed. If I start at the top and then work down the organisation, it should embed much more, because there's the environment to do that. But ideally, we're a 30,000 people organisation, we have to start somewhere. So we're looking at some of those things. But when I talk about no programme, it doesn't mean to say that there's not a lot of very clear planning involved in exactly what types of interesting new research, opportunities for people to experience things that we can actually put in front of some of our leaders to help stimulate their curiosity. And just a couple of things I wanted to kind of highlight that we're doing. So quite a lot of opportunity for them to think about the human system and understand how you motivate a human system, the whole systemic leadership, and how, it's not just about leading their bit of the organisation anymore. It's actually, there's quite a lot of soft leadership required as well as, traditional leadership. And then we've been doing quite a lot of work with them to help them sort of, us, me, all of us, flex our muscles a little bit in terms of realising there's always more to learn. There's so much research coming out on neuroscience right now in the spirit of leadership, and it's new research. And so we can start to stimulate people by putting in front of them a lot of new research that might then help to build that learning muscle and start to create a more continuous learning
No, I
community.
think Paula's point about process is the right one. Again, what used to happen would be that you'd build a competency programme and you'd go off and you'd build a leadership programme which supported people changing their behaviours in that way. That's about 2 years' work. You're probably too late from the moment that you've started. And there's too much, it seems to me, heavy process in building those programmes, and too much cost, which means that you automatically put an entry gate at it that says that, unless you're senior enough, you can't go on the leadership development programme. If Paula's right, and I think she is, leadership happens in all levels of the organisation, and she's right, and I think she is, that the process isn't the answer. It needs to be something much more flexible, much more emergent, much more available. Then I think that we have to kind of think about the role of programmes, and maybe Paula's right, we need to still have them, but we need to put learning into the workplace. We need to make sure that leaders, when they're doing things, get the support in order to be able to learn while they do it. Aristotle said, what we learn best, we learn by doing. We think that we can do that by creating a laboratory in a classroom and then sending them out into the real world and expecting them to be able to do it where the work happens. And I think that's insufficient. We have some experience with new leaders in our organisation where we pair them with a coach early. We give them 3 months' worth of contact with a coach and a book, the Harvard Business Review 90-day book. And at the end of that, we put an HR professional in a room with their team without an agenda in particular, other than at the end of this, we will have worked out how we work together as a team. and whatever happens in that room is emotionally intelligent, it's reflecting the real situation, it's identifying a group dynamic and dealing with it, and out of that there is learning not only for the leader but also for the team, which that HR professional can facilitate. And I think there's probably more value in that than in taking a bunch of leaders into a room and saying, this is how you talk about values with your team, this is how you develop a purpose, this is how you explain ways of working which people are with, this is how you facilitate a group.
I think one of the problems is there's so much external pressure. So, you've still got to deliver your returns to your shareholders. There's a lot of kind of political uncertainty that means no one really knows what's going to happen in certain areas. So how do you create that space and give permission to have that kind of learning culture? Because I think it's so easy to just put that to one side because I have to deliver this and this is what I am judged on. And this is what maybe I'm even rewarded on. So I don't know if Kate or Gemma, you have any tips on kind of creating a more facilitative and coaching learning culture?
And I think it's about how you cut through all of the sense of needing to get people in a room to learn together and do together. And I agree with the point about it's about putting it into practice, but the phraseology we use is it's from taking it from doing to being. So this is about how you cut through what I do as a leader to how I show up as a leader. And a whole sense of what's at the heart of that, perhaps to the anchor point that Gemma was making, is about why I do this. So why I do it as an individual, why my team do this around me, why the organisation does this. So it's a systemic question as well. So the heart of all of that is why are we doing this in the first place? Yes. And starting from why am I here as a leader and what am I putting into practice in the way I inspire people? So I don't think that answered your question, but it was leading on from where the conversation was going, and the conversation we had previously, which was about moving from knowing to doing to being. So how to facilitate, I think, was your question.
Yeah, well, kind of how do you create the permission and the space? Because I think we're all under such immense pressure that it's kind of hard to move to that space because it's easier to just deliver what we are judged on.
I think there's, for me, there's a couple of things. One is creating the permission to make mistakes, and in doing so also being comfortable with delegating. I mean, these are age-old concepts, but they're things that we often just don't get right in organisations, in the moment, in the spotlight, when pressure is running. But leaders all too often have too much to do. Because they're doing it all themselves, as opposed to actually creating an environment where some of that can actually be shared, but in a supportive way, where you are not bashing people over the head if they kind of do get things wrong, and that there's a support network, a support kind of net for mistakes, for things done not quite the way you would have done it. And that for me comes back to the self-awareness point. You may do it that way, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone else would do it that way, and is the end point still something that is something that is good for the organisation all around. And where people don't necessarily recognise that, there's a lack of self-awareness there, that actually there's generally more than one way to do things. So creating the space, for me, is you have to start with making sure that there's no fear of failure, there's no fear of actually kind of consequences to kind of mistakes.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about kind of distributed leadership, and that's something that you picked up on, and I know that Kate's picked up on as well, is having leaders at every level. So leadership isn't being, the big boss. Leadership can come from anywhere. Kind of, how do we give people the permission, perhaps at lower levels in the organisation, to display leadership qualities?
Yeah, and that comes in many layers. So it's either by level, it might be by geography, it might just simply be by unit of activity, and certainly in our organisation, I think left unchecked, you can end up with everything needing to bubble up to the top, because that often happens, doesn't it? When something doesn't quite go right, the answer is, well, it must need to bubble up to the top, and then you've got sort of lots of levels of people almost doing the same thing. So there's certainly a role for keeping ourselves focused on overall sort of OD principles, really, org design principles around who's doing what at which level. There's something about that I think that we can play a role in as HR professionals. But aside from that, from the leadership perspective, I was interested in linking that to the previous point, really, about how do you sort of ensure the outcome of leadership? And we all do essentially what we're measured on in some sense or other. It's a crude way of putting it, but and there's always this tension. I've observed it, over many years of there is a skew towards measuring the what, the outcome, the doing, and then as an afterthought we sort of think about and how did people do that? And what we're looking to do, certainly at leadership levels, is to really think about setting expectations with clear indicators of what that looks like right at the front of the year that says, actually, if you're a leader, most of your time should be spent in that space, therefore most of what we measure should be in that space. We're all familiar with that graph that talks about, the more senior you are, the more you spend on leadership and the less you spend on doing. And there's something around aligning how we manage people's performance on that. But there's something around making sure that that works at all levels of an organisation. Otherwise, there is just still this focus on the doing. And then the ability to step back from that and trust that someone will manage the leading piece of it in their own way, is a bit of a shift. I'm looking in our organisation for pockets where we can absolutely role model it through the organisation and put in some intensive coaching to really check in with people to say, are you stepping in or are you stepping back? And how much space are you giving people to be able to perform against the leadership characteristics of their job, not just the delivery?
I think the point about the doing is really interesting, because that makes me think regularly about the whole concept of the glorification of busy and your sort of justification for your kind of day-to-day activity is by doing and doing and doing and activity and activity and activity. When
this is the end of your first meeting session, please move on to meeting number 2. Thank you.
Don't think that applies to us.
When in actual fact, I remember a long time ago talking to a friend who was caught by his boss in his chair staring out of the window. And his response to his boss's challenge, when his boss was sort of saying, well, what are you doing? You're daydreaming. He said, no, I'm thinking. And the actual lack of respect for what's needed in terms of actually thinking and being as opposed to doing. If he was at his computer tapping away and on the phone and talking to people, that's okay, big tick. Staring out of the window suddenly seems to sort of imply that you're not working, when in fact he was thinking through something that was really quite tough and complex, and it needed some kind of careful consideration. And that for me hit the nail on the head in terms of this whole concept of doing all the time, and actually when are you in and doing, and when are you actually stepping back and considering and being a little more kind of thoughtful in what needs to happen next.
That's fascinating. That's why I never go into the office.
So I mean, my observation is that leadership is practiced in individual relationships. So it's absolutely what happens when two people are working together. That's where leadership takes place. And I think that most organisations, partly through process, are really world class at getting in the way of people doing the right things. And I think that Gemma's example is a perfect one of actually what is it that you want leaders to do. So well-intentioned or not, the question, what the hell are you doing, comes with an enormous weight of organisational expectation, which is inappropriate and unhelpful to the outcome that you're expecting to be able to achieve. And I think, your question at the beginning of this little segue, Katie, was what do we do in order to facilitate leadership at all levels in the organisation? To which my answer is it's there already, we just stop it flourishing. We just stop it happening. So if Dan Pink's right, I think it probably is, everybody is motivated by autonomy, everybody is motivated by purpose, everybody is motivated by a sense of mastery of what it is that they do. And what we do is to get in the way of all of that good stuff happening and delivering organisational outcomes. And go on, Dominic.
I was going to say, is there not a fundamental issue in terms of just understanding what leadership is? Mm-hmm. You can almost imagine the classic newspaper cartoon of an alien confronting a guy saying, "Take me to a leader," and the guy going, "Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean supervisory? Do you mean management? Do you mean strategic?" And I think you ask the general population in your organisation, who are the leaders, I don't think they'll give you a consistent message. And we almost bundle everything, and some of it isn't leadership. A supervisor doesn't necessarily mean that he's a leader. And again, the old adage of, manager, difference between manager and leader is managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. Do you have leadership? We say, we've got leaders at all levels. No, you haven't.
I think that's what Paula was saying was so interesting. It's like you go around the organisation, the thing people are asking for, we want better leadership. I don't think they probably understand what they're asking for, and the leaders probably think that they're giving perfectly good leadership.
First step into management to super doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly I'm a leader. And that's the piece now. We're bundling everything into the same title of leader. I mean, there needs to be some absolute clarity, decisiveness about what we mean by that.
Sorry, I agree with you and I disagree with that. Because I actually think in fast-moving organisations, you need your leadership distributed right across the organisation. I think in the good old days, it was fine to sit at the top and then your leadership was just, you told your managers, your people below you what to do. I think you can't do it now because it's far too fast-moving. And you can't have decisions going up and then coming down, because by the time they do come down, the time has passed. So I think our frontline managers, our middle managers actually need to have the competencies of leadership. They need to have the soft skills around, empathy, being able to do all of that, as well as the tactical and the practical, task-oriented roles. They need to be able to lead the people side of things, because at the top level, we don't have that visibility anymore that we used to have. And the other thing as well is challenging them for the senior management, for executives. If leadership is happening further down the organisation, what is the kind of leadership that is expected? Because our competencies need to jump. We need to actually jump up to the next plate. So in a sense, by actually keeping our level, us doing too much, we're denying people further down the organisation. And we're actually denying the organisation the ability to move quickly and innovatively and at pace. So I think there's a real challenge to us as executives to up our game, so that people below us can also up their leadership game. And I think that for me is the real challenge. And also at various levels of the organisation, being very clear about the expectation around what leadership looks like, what is the expectation, what are the competencies, and developing people for those competencies. I don't think we can afford to just have leadership at the top anymore.
And it's how we, not only competencies I think, but also behaviours. So what do we expect in terms of behaviours, and therefore the culture of the organisation.
And behavioural competencies as well.
And that, so the culture starts at the level of the individual, I believe. So how we role model that as hierarchical leaders of the organisation, but also how we support and encourage it throughout an organisation. So by making it clear what those behaviours are that are expected culturally, and supporting them and encouraging them and celebrating them when we see them, but also calling them out if we don't. So that whole conversation that ensues around it as well, I think is critical to that.
I'm just going to turn this gentleman's question onto you, Kate. So your company kind of sells leadership expertise. So how are you defining what leadership is when you're going out and meeting your clients?
So it is about being. So I come back to this sense of it's not about understanding, it's not about even competencies or skills, but it's about behaviours. So it really does go back to the why are you doing this, so the whole purpose perspective. So whether leadership is just at the top, I'm not convinced it is. I think it is everywhere. So it's probably nowhere and everywhere at the same time in a way. And so it does very much come down to the responsibility and ownership at an individual level. But that needs to be role modelled by the people that are most likely to be listened to, I would suggest.
Quite existential about leadership there. Has anybody else got any comments or questions before I probably take it off in some weird direction?
I think it's just about providing clarity and support, because you listen to all the things there that we expect our frontline managers to do, and it's huge. The responsibility, and when you start to map out the job spec, they just haven't got enough time in the day. And I think, we've got that within our organisation at the moment. Do you want them to be people leaders? Do you want them to be kind of inspirational leaders? Do you want them to be task workflow managers? And it's just working out organisationally where you're going to have that conflict and provide the support, because it's so much, particularly that more junior management level.
Yeah, and I think I'd answer your point slightly differently. So a frontline supervisor in a call centre organising a team roadshow has got a choice. Yeah, she can sit down in a darkened room and put it into a spreadsheet, or she can sit down with the team and say, how are we going to do this? The first is supervisory, the second is leadership, in one definition of how that works. And I think the more people make the choice to do it the second way, the more engaged, the more productive your organisation is likely to be. So I would like to see leadership everywhere. And I say that partly because our organisation is full of software developers who, if we tell them what to do, we're wasting our time, because I don't know the answer. The person that managed them doesn't know the answer. They have to find it. They have to deal with it. So I think it should be everywhere. I think what we're talking about is a different style of engagement with people in the business to facilitate a greater outcome. And I think that happens in the individual.
I think there was a hand at the back.
There was, sorry. I'm Karen, so I work for Co-op. So I work for a very diverse organisation, and it's very interesting listening to the guy with his head speak from another business school, because I think where my head is at and my colleagues are at across the HR leadership team, across the group, are that there's no one answer for everybody. Because a bit like what you said, Paula, we've got funeral care homes, we've got stores, we've got distribution centres, we've got call centres that deal with legal services, with insurance services. What you've got to do is have a model that drives a consistent message about what the culture of the organisation is about, but then be able to flex the leadership styles depending on what your needs are. So in our distribution centres, we're going to measure their pick rating. So your first line managers need to be able to measure tasks. You can call them fancy leaders all you want, but the reality is they're going to be measuring productivity on a day-to-day basis. But they've also got to manage the individual and how you balance that contrary. In a store, that store manager at quite a low level holds the keys and holds the turnover and the cash. And actually they've got a lot of responsibility. For funeral care homes, it's the worst time of somebody's life. So I think what you've got to be able to do is have something and be able to, I like your idea about giving people something that they can go and pick and choose from, Paula, and look at and see what's relevant to them, but also the stepping in and stepping back element as well. Because sometimes we don't allow people to make those decisions, or we do, but we don't give them the safety net underneath it as well. So I just think there's no right answer. It's really how you do the diversity and offer, and make the right choices for each individual business and where they're at as well. So.
And one of the things we were discussing earlier, that's not kind of related, my brain process is working, is the kind of leading for inclusion and people wanting different things. And Paula, you were talking earlier about how do we kind of develop the kind of leaders that are comfortable with the fact that we are all individual and we all want different things. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting and linked to what you were saying about leadership is practiced in individual relationships. I really like that. I might steal that phrase, because at the end of the day, the inclusion agenda, and I mean inclusion in its wider sense. So everything from what we might have called diversity all the way through to the emerging social issues that have been happening for decades, but are really, really prominent now in workplaces around mental health. And there's so much brilliant exposure of these issues now. We're starting to talk about this so much more as an HR community. But it's not about us as HR professionals. This actually is about that individual relationship. So whether it is the way somebody thinks and whether the way they think needs to be given some space to be accommodated in a different way so they can contribute in their best way. from somebody who's got a disability and requires a reasonable adjustment to, you know, everything for the more traditional diversity aspects around gender diversity and maybe looking at, you know, flexible workplaces. And at the end of the day, we can have as much policy around all of that as we want, but to tap into that, to make sure it's about that complete decentralisation so that leaders are able to be capable of having very human relationships with different people in their teams. And I take the point. I think that has different forms depending on your job. So if I took your example of, you know, your picking centre, you know, that could be quite similar to some of my caseworking operations where, you know, we have to process certain things in a certain time frame. But that doesn't preclude me as a supervisor stroke leader in that instance from having a human relationship with everybody in that team and understanding how to get the best out of every single individual. The same as it would if I were in a relationship where I'm regularly engaging with somebody because the nature of the job means that that's what we do. And so there's a nuance to how that shows up. And the trick, I think, for leaders is understanding the nuance of how that shows up in the job that they're doing and then who they are. And that comes back to your anchor point around, you know, who am I as a leader in my, you know, picking plant where I don't actually, you know, I might have 200 people on a shift. I'm not going to talk to each of those people individually, but how do I get the best out of those people? Recognising that they've all come to work that day with something that's either visible or non-visible, and the chance for us to get the best out of them. If that's not what leadership's about, and at the core of inclusivity and accessing the best workforce, then I'm not quite sure what it is. So for me, there's something absolutely that runs through as a sort of golden thread through leadership, which is about individual and human relationships.
The non-visible is a really important point. I've started working with an organisation, a company called Open Blend Method, and that's a really new kind of way of managing conversations or helping managers and leaders to have conversations with people in their team around the concept of that person being a whole human being. So using well-being and performance in a blended way, and helping that individual has complete autonomy to choose the 8 most important things to them in their world, where they can be their optimum if they kind of actually have address those eight elements out of 28. So it's a piece of software that kind of helps that conversation happen in a supported coaching way to guide managers in having those conversations in that style, because people are not necessarily natural coaches. People don't necessarily understand kind of coaching methodology, and trying to kind of, you know, push that through an organisation without some kind of support framework is actually incredibly difficult. And what we're finding with kind of, you know, some of the kind of insights that we're getting from kind of companies that are using that tool is that people are actually kind of embracing the idea of literally having a one-to-one conversation that is a bit broader than the 3 KPIs they've got for this quarter, and you know how that's been going and how that's kind of, you know, not been going well in certain areas. To actually kind of talk about those things, but also other things, also the stuff that's going on outside, the career aspirations. You know, actually for me, career progression isn't important for me right now, because what I'd like to do is this and this over here, and then in a year or so's time, maybe career progression actually becomes quite important to that person. People flex and move at different points in their kind of in their careers, in their life, in their own sort of aspirations. We all only have so much space for stuff, and sometimes there's other stuff that kind of takes that space. And kind of taking those conversations down to an individual level is incredibly important and incredibly empowering. And I think that kind of helps to, untap some of that invisible stuff that actually can be at the heart of kind of what's going on in that person's kind of productivity.
One of the things you said there is some people are not natural coaches. One of the things that's kind of coming very clear to me listening to this is it does seem that we need a coaching, facilitative, human style of leadership. If that is somebody's not their natural way of being, if they're more comfortable with command and control. How do you move them? Or if we're saying everybody's an individual, should we let people lead in a way that they're comfortable with, even if it's not the way that we think is the best way to lead in the new environment? I review.
So I think the question comes back to culture again, and what's expected and what's embraced in the organisation. So I guess there is something about the system helping define that. The other piece that speaks to me from that is about reflection, and whether or not people are individuals, leaders, are self-aware, and how the paradox of needing to do more with less time, and at the same time expecting people to understand who they are and how they impact others. So valuing and creating space in people's days for reflecting and recognising how do I show up myself in the style that I want to bring as a leader, and also how do I notice what impact that has. But there's something from all the conversation for me about how we value that in the day-to-day work, and how we create space for reflection and enable that.
For me, it's about borrowing styles. So it's about the kind of there is a place for command and control. As a coach, that's an uncomfortable thing to say in many ways, but actually it's true. There is a place for command and control style leadership. There's also a place for coaching leadership, and I think we're in danger of it being an either-or kind of discussion, when in fact there needs to be a degree of flexing across those styles depending on what's needed in a particular situation. And when somebody is more comfortable with one particular style than another, it's about actually kind of enabling that person to recognise that at times this style is better and at times this style is better, and you can borrow some behaviours that are not necessarily your own preference to suit the needs of that particular situation.
I think we've got time for one more. I'll just go to the floor quickly if anyone's got another question.
So I think what's really interesting is what we're discussing is leadership behaviours in kind of the current context, maybe of how things are in the workplace, and assuming that managers and leaders have the ability to have that one-to-one relationship, and that they see their people on a regular basis and they can build that relationship. What's interesting, I think, is that looking forward and projecting forward to some of the ways of working that we learned about first thing, in terms of what will the makeup of the workforce look like in the talent ecosystem, where potentially people are much more transient, they're much more kind of project-based, working for lots of different organisations, and kind of maybe the whole virtual teams taken to the next level in the next 5 to 10 years with all of the new technology and what that might look like, and then how that transposes into leadership behaviours and how that might need to change over time, and how we as HR professionals kind of ensure that the leaders of the future have got the skills to be able to support those people in getting the best out of those people and enabling them to be the best that they can, but recognising that they're not necessarily managing somebody that's picking stuff on a front line. They might be leading and managing people all over the place, which is happening now, but I think will just become more exaggerated when we look forward.
It's a really great question. I wish I'd asked that question.
So, I mean, geographically, our leaders lead people all over the world, and it's absolutely a challenge. It's an awful lot easier to sit in front of someone with a cup of coffee and have a chat than it is to try and do it over WebEx. And that's real. And what's the answer? The answer is get on an airplane at least a couple times a year and go and talk to people face to face over a cup of coffee. There isn't a better one that I've got at the moment, for sure. To your point about contractors, I don't understand why any leader in our organisation would take a different approach to somebody who's here for 6 months, 3 months, a year, 2 years, some long projects, than they would for someone here who is on a contract of employment. Because actually the people who are on contracts of employment are likely to be here for 3, 6, 12, 24 months anyway. There is no permanence. If what you want is to achieve the best organisational performance from the people that you lead, whatever their method of contracting with the organisation is irrelevant. You still need to deal with them in exactly the same way, in my view. And it's just lazy to say, they're here on a contract, I'm not going to do anything about it.
I agree, and I think there's actually going to probably be more emphasis on all of the stuff you've been talking about when people are integrating their work life with their home life. They're not necessarily even going to be in offices to go and sit and have that coffee once every 6 months, it will be more of an effort, I think, to make sure that those behaviours and those things happen than it potentially is.
I agree, and I was just going to say, you know, it's a hot topic in all the presses about performance management and does it exist anymore and should we throw it away? Actually, it's an awful lot easier to manage some contractors sometimes because they don't have to have an annual appraisal because their rate of pay is fixed at the beginning of the engagement, and you can just push all of that process out the way. And just say, okay, we know what we're here to do. We know how long we're here for. It doesn't matter whether, I'm not going to give you a rating at the end of it. Our job is to get to the end of this with the right outcome for the business. And I think that, to my earlier point, sometimes we're just really good at putting process in the way of making relationships as productive as they should be.
So I'm going to have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. I've just got one question I'm going to put to, I'll start with Paula. So as we've been talking a lot about developing leaders. One of the things that I often see in my role is perhaps HR not quite practicing what it preaches. It's developing the rest of the organisation. How is it developing itself, its teams, and as an HR director? So as senior HR professionals, how do you show up? How do you develop your own personal style of leadership, and how are you cascading that to your teams, and what do you see as your responsibility here? I'll start with Paula.
Well, so we've got to hold ourselves to account to the things that we expect our clients to do, if you kind of put it that way. So I absolutely believe in that. It's really hard, and I think it's really good to know. Time is the thing that I find challenging. So, but knowing that helps us, I think, to help the people we work with so much more, because we're no different to anybody else from that perspective. Some of the things I'm trying to do so we've got a whole process around capability building, which is an ongoing process for our HR professionals. We're resourcing at the moment, so we're hiring in a different mix of people so that we challenge ourselves to keep current. In terms of myself, so my office, spend an inordinate amount of time trying to juggle the fact that I want to get out of the office and go out and about, and I don't want to go and meet with the people who are in my senior team because I see them enough. What I want to do is go and spend time with people in my team, and I don't want this whole, when you go somewhere and you have sort of like the royal visit, and you go and there's a whole group of people in a room sort of waiting for you to say something, and I've very clearly said, I just don't want to do that. What I want to do is go somewhere and then just individually go and sit at people's desks and let's just show me what you do, and we'll find a conversation from there. Fitting it in, really hard, because I've got a huge amount of demands on my time and managing family and everything else that I'm trying to do. But there's a couple of examples of what I'm trying to do.
Gemma?
There's obviously always a real danger of kind of cobbler shoes, and HR kind of comes last in the pecking order of giving itself permission to develop. I try to keep that front and centre, and actually kind of encourage that to be a priority, and encourage the HR kind of team to be across a lot of the development activity, and also really think about their own development in that context when I'm spending time with them. And I think the other thing is really encouraging teams to externally network, which seems to be something that kind of gets forgotten about at a more junior level. And often isn't fitted in at a more senior level as well. But there's just so much to be learned by kind of taking the lens out of the internal and into the external, and actually really encouraging those networks. So there's probably a couple of things there.
So well done for coming here. Keep it quite brief.
Yes,
being pointed at.
So I think it's about taking responsibility for being present in the conversation on one level. So a little bit to the point around leading virtual organisations. If every conversation we have, we're able to be truly mindful in the moment and present, and considering being aware of myself, but also thinking about the impact that I'm having on somebody else, then I think we will make a huge difference.
Kevin, finish us off with something amazing. No pressure.
So one of the many things that I've done with my team, which I think Katie knows, which is why she's put me last, is that I've issued yellow cards. So I absolutely understand that my behaviour is the thing that influences the way that our organisation works, the HR organisation. All of my team have got yellow cards. When they see me behaving in a way which was inconsistent with what I want, yellow card. It hurts the first time. The second and third times, I take it as valuable feedback, and we've percolated that into the rest of the organisation.
I really love that initiative. I will wrap up there. Thank you so much for coming along, for listening, and for asking questions and being engaged. I will let you all free now to be more human leaders. Thank you.
Use those.